Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Behind the Mic, the podcaster's Playbook. Today, we are talking all things pre-production, such as defining your target audience, setting goals, brand development, and so much more. And today, we are chatting again with Brad and Nick. Hi, guys.
Hello.
Our podcast experts. Great. So let's start with the first thing, setting goals. And a great way to do that is to ask yourself, what do I want my podcast to achieve? So when people are thinking about what they want their podcast to achieve, what kind of questions should they be asking themselves, Nick?
Well, once you've figured out the niche and the niche of your podcast, what you want it to be, it's then figuring out the sort of direction you want to go where it comes to, are you trying to educate your audience? Are you trying to just entertain them? You know, what direction are you trying to go in, and what purpose is your podcast going to be serving?
Yeah, exactly. Brad, any others?
I think it somewhat differs depending on whether it's coming from the perspective of like a business and this is a brand and marketing exercise, or you're just an individual, a creator, it's personal brand, or it's, something that's less aligned to a specific business. But understanding, beyond just, I want to start a podcast, why podcast? And from that, what are you hoping to get from it? And whatever that is fine. But understanding that really sets you up in terms of being able to align all of your actions going forward with what that looks like, whether it's a brand building exercise or it's, like Nick said, educating, entertaining.
Okay, great. So a brand building exercise that would possibly look like something like just growing your audience through the podcast to have greater brand recognition.
Yeah, so I think primarily at the moment that's what people from a business perspective are looking at it for, is as a brand and marketing exercise. It's, generating and raising awareness about the business, what it does, through expanding that audience. And I think where podcasts are really good there is that you're aligning your content with an audience who want to consume and are mutually interested in that. So it's just like a natural exchange of value.
Yes. Hopefully those kind of podcasts can also be entertaining and educational at the same time.
Which, easier said than done, as we all know.
Yes.
Yeah.
Great. So if someone is creating an educational podcast, how do I know I can believe that the medical advice or maybe the legal advice or stuff that you're throwing out there is trustworthy?
Well, I think that's where it's good to sort of go in the direction and choose a podcast where you already have expertise on it. So that be with for us it's podcast, so I reckon a podcast about podcasts. But if you are, let's say in the medical field and you very, very educated in the medical field, it might be good to start a podcast about the medical field.
Yeah, and you should probably not lie about your qualifications. Hot topic.
Little bit of podcast news. Jay Shetty is being, we're not talking about cancellation, but Jay Shetty is being appropriately reprimanded for falsifying or allegedly falsifying
yes.
qualifications and leading people to believe he was more than what he had qualified in. What we were talking about earlier was it's sad because a lot of the stuff that he says and the advice he gives and the guests he's had on have been really good, really valuable, and all of it's now been damaged by this alleged falsehood.
So maybe now you've decided what the goals for your podcast are. Make sure they're SMART goals. If you don't know what SMART goals are, read it. It's going to help you stay on track.
Or go read the CAYA Guide to Podcasting, which expands on SMART goals and what they do and the role they play in helping keep you aligned and create goals that are effective.
So maybe we have our goals down now, but we need listeners, an audience. How do we go about finding that audience?
I think for me that over the last little while has been the most valuable kind of thing to lean into is understanding who the target audience is of the podcast. And this is where, again, we're looking at podcasting as less as a medium thing or like a digital media product deliverable, and more as podcast marketing as a part of one's marketing strategy. So, from a business perspective, often you have an understanding of who that business's target audience is, and so you can build from there. But even just as an individual creator, you've had this idea for your podcast and you want to put it out. Are you catering to basically you and other people who have a similar set of interests? Who are they? Like, quantify that, understand that. And I think by doing that, you can keep that understanding of your target audience, or using tools like customer profiles, where you like build little imaginary avatars of people in your target audience to help like understand the different segments, all broken down in the CAYA Guide to Podcasting. You can create content with them in mind as a bit more, concrete of a visual or an image, and make sure that you're creating content that's valuable to that person. And I think if you're creating valuable content to that person and there's enough people that fit in that target audience, you're on track for a winner.
You've mentioned making sure that your content stays valuable and aligned with your target audience's topics, which brings us to a next really valuable part of pre-production, which is content pillars. What are content pillars?
Yes. So your content pillars is basically the theme of your podcast, the theme of your podcast and what your podcast is going to be about. And that's like where you can really create a sort of structure for your podcast by looking at your content pillars. It's where you can pull out your ideas. It's all like really goes back to your content pillars. Yeah.
Okay. So what I'm understanding is it's like the core topics that our podcast should stay focused on.
Yes.
Okay. And Bradley, what's going to happen to our structure if those content pillars are not adhered to? Give us the analogy.
So where content pillars come in really handy, and it's kind of combining your core idea, why I want to have a podcast to do X, and that understanding of your target audience and your customer profiles, etc., to, like Nick said, give structure to what your podcast is going to be and give yourself a framework to build your podcast on. Now, we like the analogy of a platform with pillars. Like, we can think very literally about this. And, if one's being efficient, you don't need more than 3 or 4 pillars for a good, stable platform. Any more, you're probably just wasting pillars, right? It's getting a little bit diluted. Any less, that's not a very stable platform. And if we think about a square platform with 4 corners, what I think people misunderstand when people are talking about content pillars is like, okay, well, I have my 4 content pillars. A piece of content has to be one or the other, or maybe a combination. And I think it's kind of looking at it as that should be where your content is concentrated around. So if we think of, each individual piece of content or topic within your podcast over a season being little, weights on the platform, it's important to make sure that most of that weight is concentrated around those 4 content pillars so that the platform stays stable. If it's all in the middle and kind of all just a confusing mishmash of all of it, there's nothing clear there, it's going to fall apart. No pun intended. But that's not to say you can't sometimes talk about things that are a combination of all of them, but keeping things weighted towards one side of the platform or one corner of the platform helps you just have a coherent structure to your podcast.
Okay. So let's say I had a podcast about finance and people started listening because I was giving really valuable like updates on the markets, or, they had the latest and greatest best news in whatever financial topic I'm talking about. But I'm suddenly throwing in like a lot of finance memes, and the podcast has become quite reliant on this like entertaining comical aspect of it. Would you say my platform is now like, it's not very equal? Might I lose my audience that were there for the more educational side of what was going on?
So, I think there's an excellent example of what I think you're saying there is like, I started and it was almost exclusively like call it like a hyper, like intellectual, high end financial advice market, and then I flip over to most of my content being like piss takes memes, like crypto memes, that kind of shit. Am I going to lose that existing audience that I built with this like really high IP, high value, cutting edge information? Am I going to lose that? Yeah, probably. But if you'd started your podcast having a balance and your perspective as a podcast, your unique take was, I'm the guy who gives you cutting edge financial, insight with a really like clever sense of humor, then you have the ability on your platform to have both. There's space for both. If you start and you're all on one pillar and then you try and move over to the other, there's no structure to support that. The platform is going to collapse.
Exactly.
Brilliant.
I think you guys are getting the picture. Okay, so once we've decided on our content pillars, how do you make sure that your podcast is reflective of those core topics?
I think creating an outline for your each episode. So not sort of a script, just like an outline to make sure that your podcast the conversation doesn't sort of lose track, or what's the word, like
A tangent.
yeah, lose tangent of
Something Brad is expert in.
yeah, because it's easy to just sort of get off topic and start rambling about things that
Yes.
and having that outline is just good for you to always just come back to and be like, okay, we went off topic there, which is good sometimes, not always bad, sometimes nice to get into more detail and depth on a certain topic. But it's also good to have that outline to be able to step back and be like, okay, let's stick to what we're talking about.
I see what you're saying. So maybe we use our finance podcast example again. You got a bit sidetracked with the memes and the shit takes and all of that, and you completely forgot the side of your episode that was giving the more valuable new information. Yes. Okay, exactly, great. Yeah. And then overall, Brad, like in a season, how do you make sure that your season comes together cohesively?
So I think, it's in the balance between, I think some episodes might, tend more towards one pillar than the other, particularly if you've got a guest who's, an expert or a field leader in one of your key content pillars. Then, it's natural for that episode to, maybe focus on that one majority and then it'll touch on a couple of others. And I think it's important, for your audience and looking at, like understanding that you have elements of your audience who are going to be interested more in one content pillar than the other. So I think it's on one hand trying to always include an element from each of your content pillars for each of those, customer profiles. And then to make sure that over the course of a season, or if you're not a seasonal podcast, like over the course of 10 episodes, am I roughly, proportionately having 2 or 3 guests from each content pillar if I've got 3 or 4? Am I retaining some semblance of balance there for my audience over time and making sure that I'm catering to each of them, regularly enough? I think those are the 2 elements, like episodic balance to a degree, and then seasonal balance or balance over time.
Amazing. Thank you. Okay, now that we have our audience and we have our content pillars and our outline of what we want to talk about, what is the format of our podcast going to be? Am I talking just me and the camera? Am I talking to one person, 2 person? Is it more of like a roundtable discussion? Brad, what are some of the like pros or cons of, let's say, a solo podcast adventure?
Cool. So, I mean, one of the most obvious advantages with a solo podcast is you can do it kind of whenever you want. Obviously, production details permitting, but you don't have to coordinate with anyone else to record episodes. And I think from a pure creative perspective, that's a pro.
Yes. I think we've seen a lot of duo, trio podcasts kind of simmer down to one core person.
Yeah.
Sometimes it is just easier
Yeah.
to
The coordination, consistency, and all of those things, I think. So that's one element. I think another pro, although again could be a con, would be that you do have kind of sole creative as the host. You've got sole input into what's happening, where the conversation's going. I think that can be a con though as well. And then in terms of cons, I think, leaning further into that, it's a lot for one individual to be consistently internally energized and passionate about every episode, but B, for your audience to stay, really locked in. That's a lot of one voice, especially over time. That being said, I mean, there are countless very well-known, solo narrator, serial podcasts, it definitely can work. But I think often that's why people will go with a duo, is to have the kind of interaction and the diversity of voices and perspectives, and then you can have a conversation.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. So getting onto that, a conversation where there's more than one person. Nick, what do you think are some of the benefits to an interview style type podcast where you have multiple guests or rotation of guests?
I think like the obvious thing is just having a different perspective on it. It's really good to like pick guests that has different perspectives than your own. And that's also where you can really get into the detail and like get in depth into topics and talk about it in depth.
Okay, so I see what you're saying. Like, let's say with my finance podcast, I've run out of all the finance knowledge I know, but like that might not happen if I'm able to bring in people in different financial sectors and they're bringing in new information, new perspectives. It sort of keeps it all flowing. I think being a solo podcaster, Brad, from what I was getting from what you were saying, is a bit more taxing.
Yeah.
Or it definitely takes a lot more from the host.
Yeah, for sure. The load is much heavier on the host in a solo, whereas, like Nick's saying, in a more interview style one, the onus often is actually, or the majority of the content will be coming from the guest, because the point is the guest is the host saying, listen, I know this person, I know they've got a lot of value to share with my audience. I'm going to curate and shape that conversation for the guest to provide maximum value.
Also, when you bring on a guest that will have an audience of their own, and them being on your podcast, they will also be bringing that audience to your podcast, and that broadens your target audience as well.
Okay, wonderful. So now we have our solo podcaster, our interview style podcasters. Let's think about a round table situation, because first thing that comes to my mind is maybe everyone wants to yappa, and then how do we control things? Someone give me some thoughts. I'm panicking. There was just so much valuable information on pre-production that we've decided to split this episode into 2 parts. So make sure you subscribe and come back for part 2 coming next week.